So I know I said I was going to be making a Cyberpunk video today, but in reality, we actually got some new gameplay of The Outer Worlds. This is pretty exciting. It's some really cool new gameplay and very interesting. It's one of those things that I think on first pass, just someone watching it might be like, oh, that was kind of disappointing. But as you'll see in this video, actually analyzing it, looking at some of the stuff you can see in the background, there's a lot of stuff shared here, and it, I think, introduces us into several new mechanics of this game that we previously didn't really know about. All of this information is coming from Game Informer, as we have been covering over the past couple of videos. If you missed a few of the previous ones, I will have them linked in the little eye or at the end of this video. There's been a ton of information coming out, but up until today, we haven't seen any new gameplay. So this video is going to be broken down into 3 segments. First and foremost, the way this gameplay was distributed is really in like an interview. Like it's actually structured like this.
Wrote combat in the game. I want them to come away thinking that combat was exciting, it was fun when it happened, it was a little scary, you could always die, there was always a chance you could die.
The people being interviewed actually talk over the gameplay in its entirety, but I'll cut in between them the new gameplay and actually some old gameplay. So first and foremost, I'm going to go over the topic of the interview, the video itself, and what they talk about through it. Secondly, I'm going to go through the gameplay itself and actually just look at what details we can extract from this new gameplay. And then finally, towards the end of this video, I'm actually just going to show you guys the gameplay in its raw form. It'll still have their voiceovers and it won't make much sense, but in Game Informer's original video, they basically have 2 segments of gameplay, but for whatever reason, they actually cut it up and put them all out of order and at different spots intermixed with old gameplay and the actual people talking. So at the end of this video, I'll show you it in order and concurrently. If you guys enjoy the content, you can leave a like or subscribe, but otherwise, starting things off, the main focus of this video and the interview again was combat in the Outer Worlds. Their overall idea with the combat here was they wanted to make it fun, because even though you can pretty much avoid combat outright in this game, if you choose to go that path, most people will use it at least sometimes. They reassure that it is an RPG first, but they wanted to make it an RPG that was also fun and interesting to take enemies down in. It's going to have a system where there's going to be certain low-level encounters that you can go through quickly and without much thought. You just kind of shoot them and that's the whole thing. That's most of the gameplay we actually see in the background. But even further, they mentioned there's going to be other high-level encounters that aren't going to be quite as easy. If you choose to go the combat route, you're going to have to think about what you do. And they say in this, they want combat to always have a risk of death for your character. It should never just be a cakewalk. If you play stupidly, you will be punished for that. But one of the other major systems they talk about is companion combat. This game has a leadership system where actually speccing into having useful companions is a pretty major route you can go. So with that in mind, you could actually direct your companions to attack individual targets themselves, and even further, each companion will have a special ability they can use on enemies. We've seen this a couple of times, and when you actually tell your companion to use that special ability, it will cut to them actually doing that, and they also mention that each companion is going to have a specific attack style. We've seen things with a handgun and also a hammer, so in turn, they'll each have different strengths and weaknesses against specific enemies. Although for all of this, there's going to be perks you can take to actually benefit them. So if you want to make their special ability a bit stronger, maybe the cooldown a bit shorter, you could take a perk that will do that. But they really say there's perks for pretty much every major gameplay mechanic, such as tactical time dilation, which is the next major thing they talk about. Tactical time dilation, or TTD as they call it, is effectively their version of bullet time. You click a button and it will slow time, but it'll come at a cost. You can see a little purple meter at the top left of your screen. The way this is going to work is if you just activate tactical time dilation and look around, it's not actually going to drain all that quickly. This is intended. They say sometimes if you just want to take a breather, evaluate the situation, this can be useful and you could spend quite a bit of time in here. But if you start moving, it'll start draining even quicker, but then even quicker than that if you start shooting or take other actions. Also, while actually in this mode, you can see the status of enemies and get a bunch of information about them. In the gameplay we've seen thus far, the only way to actually get some of that information is to enter into tactical time dilation. They also talk about the unique approach they're actually taking to weapons in this game. It's going to have your typical many different categories and variants of weapons. So you're going to have energy weapons, ballistic weapons, and melee weapons, and then in that several different subcategories. But one of the real differentiating features is going to be which brand that weapon is. There's several different brands in this game, each one having its own special feature. For example, Spacer's Choice is meant to be one of the cheaper ones. It's going to have a very low condition, and weapon durability durability is a component of this game. Seemingly, your weapons will in fact break. Spacer's Choice weapons are very cheap, but at the same time, they break the quickest. Alternatively, there's going to be another brand that is much more expensive, but breaks very slowly. But it's not always just good and bad like that. There's some that are highly moddable. They name things like a silencer, different magazine sizes, and different types of scopes. If you want to use that on your weapon, you're going to have to buy it from that specific brand, which I'm sure will have other trade-offs. The way they talk about it, it really seems like each individual weapon type in this game will have an option available from each individual brand. And they say at the lower levels, you're going to see quite a variety of weapons, but also as you just progress through the game, you'll see increasingly better weapons, things that will do more damage and all around just a bit tougher. In the past, they've also talked about a separate category, that of science weapons, which are meant to break the game rules, like one they showed off was the shrink ray. So that was really the gist of the interview they gave. Again, there wasn't a ton of information in it. Some of that we kind of knew about, but they expanded on it, but we actually got a ton of information from the 2 or so minutes of raw gameplay we saw. It's not clear if Game Informer actually has more gameplay and they're just kind of holding on to it, maybe for another video on just companions, and they'll show companion gameplay. But at least as of right now, this is the only gameplay they've actually talked about having, so who knows the next time we'll see something new. But either way, one of the first things you can find is pretty much throughout all of this new gameplay, the enemies they're taking on are marauders. These guys seem extremely similar to raiders in Fallout, even down to the fact that there's different kinds of marauders. In the background, you could see both marauder thugs and marauder goons. Seemingly they'll have something different. Maybe one's melee focus, the other one is ranged focus. And we also get to see a totally new companion, that with Parvati. I'm definitely butchering that girl's name. Something odd, I assume it's just cause it's a development build, but Parvati actually doesn't have a little image on the side of your screen. All the other companions we saw did have this, but again, it's probably just cause this is an older, not released build. The Game Informer guys mentioned they actually were at the studio and got all this footage a month ago at this point. Parvati's special move is actually going to be her hammer ability. She just kind of smashes the enemy. But something pretty interesting about this, it seems like the Outer Worlds is going to have a downed system, because whenever she uses her special ability, it actually downs the enemy, doesn't outright take them out. You then have to finish them off manually. This is interesting because in the past, as we've seen companion abilities, it actually finished them off entirely. So that could be one notable feature of her. But even further, what can you do with a downed enemy? Can you take them prisoner? Is there some kind of unique gameplay mechanic? Seemingly there would be if it's even a part of this game at all. Unfortunately, in this video, all we ever see is them finishing off the downed enemy and not actually interacting with it. Something else interesting though, it seems like the Outer Worlds is going to have some kind of enemy detection system that's really obvious and abundant. It actually really reminds me of the system in Far Cry, where it'll alert you over an enemy's head when they have detected you. Watch here as the player actually approaches the enemy, you can see that little gray icon. We never really see a player gradually work their way up to an enemy. It's always kind of, they shoot an explosive barrel, so it's a very loud engage, and then you see those red icons pop up. But the way this is working, I wouldn't be shocked if there's kind of an in-between option where maybe the enemy hears something and they start looking for you, but they didn't actually locate you, or they're not actually sure you're there. Kind of like how caution works in the Fallout franchise. But even beyond that, something else interesting I noticed, when the character sneaks in those tall bushes, it almost looks like the bushes change color or become slightly transparent. I'm not sure if that's just a byproduct of the development build or an intended feature, or maybe even like a perk or something. But another really cool thing that is going to be in this game is limb damage. So in one scene, you see the player character actually shoot an enemy in the knee, and then later on you see that character running at the player, but he's limping and going noticeably slower. You also notice he does have some kind of debuff icon above his head, and that part of his body is glowing. At a later point in the video, you could also see somebody get shot in like the torso or arms, and their body also glows there. But even beyond that, at a later point, the player also takes a shot at somebody's head, and then they get a debuff that's a little eye. So this all seems really cool. Based off this footage, it seems like there's probably 3 different mechanics here. One, actually shooting the enemy's legs so they'll walk slower. A second one where maybe you could shoot them in the arm and they're maybe less accurate, or if they're a melee enemy, they'll do less melee damage. And then finally, I assume the eye one's going to make it so they're also less accurate, or maybe if you're from afar, enemies will have a much harder time detecting you. Remember how I mentioned the silencers earlier? That could be an interesting way of actually taking out a bunch of enemies quickly. Going for a proper stealth approach where you make it so you're very hard to detect, but you really don't have to take anyone out completely. Also, at one point as they're playing playing, you can actually see what looks like an enemy dodge, so that should be fun to deal with. As far as just some of the other details, there's a shovel weapon, as we could see the player using here, so it looks like not all of the weapons will be serious and some of them will be just a little bit more interesting or comical. But also the gunplay in this actually looks really smooth. They again earlier on in the video referenced how they wanted the combat to be interesting, and actually really reminds me of Fallout 4, which I would say gunplay was one of the biggest improvements they brought to the table with Fallout 4. Obviously comparing the gunplay in this game to something like Fallout New Vegas, it's literally night and day. So yeah, that was pretty much everything I took away from this gameplay and the interview. Now I'm going to show you just the raw gameplay in its order, and I'd love for you guys to comment down below if you found something that maybe I missed or you just think is interesting. As always, again, I thank you all for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope to see you all next time. Later.